Hello, my name is Chevis McMillan Brockway, and this is my thesis, Emotional Parity, Best Practices in RPGs. Today we'll be going over my hypothesis, defining terms and formulas, research, proposed best practices, the artifact and methodology, data gathering, best practices, and proposed continuations for this line of thinking. My hypothesis is that there are definable elements that are necessary to create effective emotional parity in the context of role-playing games. These are represented through intentional narrative design choices. The terms and formulas that I'd like to define for you are emotional parity, motivational parity, emotional inertia, and achieving parity in a role. First, what is emotional parity? Emotional, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is relating to a person's emotions. Parity, from the same dictionary, is the state or condition of being equal. For the context of this artifact, emotional parity is a narrative technique that creates the state of equality between the player and player character's emotions. How do games utilize emotional parity? Well, narrative designers do intentional narrative elements that facilitate the player's occupation of the player character's emotional space. This facilitation is done through the transition from motivational parity to emotional parity. The transition between the two parities is influenced through a phenomenon called emotional inertia. Continuing on with emotional or motivational parity, it can be described as the player and player character having the same motivations at the same time, or an equality of motivations. This can start out as entirely pragmatic. It can be the desire to advance the story to the next plot beat, or the desire to get a coveted item, like a brand new shiny set of armor, or even just the desire to continue the gameplay experience. All of these are valid influences for motivational parity. We have ones that are completely influenced by the player, and as the GIF illustrates, we have designer-influenced motivational parity through gameplay mechanics that they intentionally design for in their level experiences. Now, to define emotional inertia. Emotional inertia, as defined by Harrison Pink, is the combination of the player and avatar's emotional motivations, where the player's motivations outweigh the avatar's. There are two states of emotional inertia. Positive, which is the state in which the player continues to maintain the same motivational or emotional parity as the player character. And then negative, which is the state in which the player's motivational or emotional parity with the player character is put into question. An example of positive emotional inertia is the player is in an action role-playing game. They've been fighting zombies alongside their friends. They're in a room and they're spread out when a horde of zombies breaks into the room. Both friends are overwhelmed, but there's only time to save one of them. The player character is motivated to make a choice. The player is motivated to make that choice too. They pick the friend that they like the most. The illustration that I have here isn't necessarily an action role-playing game, but rather a point-and-click adventure game called Telltale's The Walking Dead, where Lee, the center protagonist there, has to choose between Doug, the person on the left, or Carly, the one on the right. With this, we've been with these characters for effectively a half an hour of gameplay time. We have Carly, who is our potential romance, a woman that is great with a gun and somebody who's helpful in a pinch. Somebody that may not be super great with technology, but she's willing to help out in a type of a pinch. And then we have Doug. He is our friend character. He is the humor. He has potential. He is able to fix found technology, such as the radio that we picked up earlier in the experience. Either one of them are valid companions for Lee. They both contribute to the party's survival. But there can only be one that comes out of this situation. And the player will pick whichever one they see best fits with their gameplay style. And Lee will have the emotional parity with the player to pick that one as well. For a negative emotional inertia, we have the players in an action role-playing game unarmed or underarmed, and they've been exploring the landscape and working their way towards a small goal. Suddenly, a massive horde of zombies appears. The player character is motivated to fight. However, the player is not. The player has questioned their motivations and is now in a state of negative emotional inertia. They disengage from the experience and possibly leave the game if the encounter is too troublesome. If they can't run away, if they can't get around the horde, if they can't rely on other NPCs to take the hit for them, then they may just leave, thinking that it's too difficult, or they may turn down the difficulty setting and miss the experience the designer wanted entirely. For achieving emotional parity in a role, it's achieved through two parts. The first is maintaining motivational parity between the player and player character, through giving achievable goals that motivate the player to stay in the game space, and allowing for enough time for the player to feel involved in the situation. And lastly, creating gameplay mechanics and moments that invest the player in the role of the player character. Then we go from there to putting the player and player character through a pivotal choice or story beat, which has relevancy to what they've been doing up until that point. Now, the state transitions look something like this. Initial player state going into the world or into the situation, going into motivational parity with our small goals, and then hitting the pivotal moment. A successful transition will see us going from that pivotal moment to positive emotional inertia and into emotional parity. Unsuccessful transition will see us going from that pivotal moment to negative emotional inertia, to questioning the motivation, to disengaging from the experience, either by trying to get away from that experience or from leaving the game. For the research that I did, I looked at common parities, a social simulation called Star Power, and then a GDC talk called Snap to Character, Building Strong Player Attachment Through Narrative. The first thing we'll go over is common emotional parity in games, and this is by no means a comprehensive list of them, just the three most common that I've observed. Starting with the most popular, which is the datification of video games. This involves the game giving the player a child, a pet, or a proxy family or family member to take care of. And then variants of racism, sexism, and classism. We see this all over fantasy and all over any sort of social simulation type of game, where the designer has the player taking the role of a marginalized group and simulating the oppression that they face in the real world space, or some sort of an equivalent to it if it's a fantasy space. And then lastly is amnesia, where the protagonist knows little to nothing about the world, creating the opportunity for the player and the player character to learn about the rules and history at the same time. This artifact will explore social stratification, which centers around the parity of classism in a standard three-tier class system structure. It puts the player in a position of authority where the characters from each social class display both sympathetic and abrasive traits towards the player, thus creating that feeling of othering. Going from there, we're going to look at star power. The full title of this social experiment is Star Power Experiencing Stratified Society. It is a social simulation that utilizes social stratification. Now, how does that contribute to emotional parity? It simulates a meritocratic democracy whose rules aren't fair. It creates emotional parity through placing players in a society where their social class motivations affect players from other social classes. Members of the upper class are given resources, high bartering power, and the privilege of governing the middle and lower classes, thus giving them the opportunity to make more rules that benefit them versus benefiting the classes that are under them. At random, one of the people from the middle or lower classes gets to advance a tier in society. This is outside of anybody's control and will randomly make that player a target for the ire for the other classes. The unfairness of the system puts pressure on the two lower classes to rebel against the upper class. Motivational parity for the needs of the other social classes go into the pivotal choices for each class that are continuously being made, which go into the emotional parity where members of each class become invested in the betterment or maintenance of their own position. Onto the GDC talk, Snap to Character, Building Strong Player Attachment Through Narrative. Harrison Pink defines quality time as the ability to take the player along the same emotional steps at the same time as the player character. Assumptions of one-to-one equivalence for emotional roles regarding the care of a child or family member as effective emotional parity don't automatically work. Relationships like family or friends have no power on their own to create effective emotional shorthand, which is true. Take, for example, Fallout 4. Fallout 4 tries to create the parity of family, or the dadification or momification of games, by starting the player out with a spouse that they interact with through about a 10-minute duration for the tutorial section, after which their spouse is killed off and their child is kidnapped. But there wasn't enough time for the player to form any sort of meaningful connection to these characters. So, unless the player has a real-world context for them to impose upon their digital equivalents, there isn't much of a way for them to care about their spouse dying and their child being kidnapped when they have an entire world to explore and new characters to interact with and form attachments to. Going over the artifact and methodology, we're going to talk about the proposed elements, the level design methodology, utilized parity, and the successes and failures that this artifact has illustrated. This artifact is a mod in Fallout 4 that playtesters spent between 30 minutes to almost 2 hours in on average. The artifact took 375 hours to build out and write, along with about 50 hours of playtesting and feedback, which loops back into the iterative process. The proposed best practices that I have are time, dialogue, diegetic narrative systems, and pivotal story moments or choices. The first thing we'll talk about is time. The player needs a significant amount of time to interact with the world. The longer the time, the more likely they'll have the ability to overcome motivational parity into emotional parity. Dialogue. When the player interacts with a space in a narrative type environment, they want to be able to have effective dialogue that feels realistic for the player character to say. They want effective reactions to interactions that make sense as feedback to the information that they're being given and the way that they're being treated within a space. I also want dialogue that feels realistic for non-player characters to say, that corresponds with their character and their motivations and their wants in the world. These interactions don't always serve the player or player character's needs. That makes the non-player characters feel closer to being human. Then diegetic narrative systems. Diegetic narrative systems are characterized in such a way that these interactions have meaning to the narrative. So, in this context, information about the world is gathered by the player in a naturalistic way. The method fits the character, and information is gathered both through dialogue interactions and interactions with the environment, which engage in constant observation of the environment. And that works for the parity of the arbiter, as the arbiter is a detective-style character that would need to work to learn the information that they need to have about the world that they're occupying. And then a pivotal story moment or choice. Something that is meaningful to the goals of the player or the bonds that they have formed. A narrative moment that makes them consider what they've been doing up until that point. We want each pivotal choice to be relevant to what the player's goals are. In this case, the player is put into the role of solving a murder case, and the pivotal moment that's being designed for is the accusation, and whether or not the player gets the right person, and if the player is able to form bonds with the person that they have accused. The level design methodology that I utilized was a quest that flows based on player exploration in the Creation Kit engine Fallout 4. I utilized global variables for notes, murder weapons, and conversations. I also utilized environmental triggers around visual clues. Since the player cannot automatically tell everything that's being conveyed, it adds notes to the inventory for the player to read later, and pop-up dialogue message boxes that lets the players read what the player character is observing. And then dialogue. Notes are added through pivotal moments of new information. And dialogue is also tracked using global variables in order to not repeat dialogue choices or just specific strings of dialogue. Dynamic tracking for murder weapons and notes in the player inventory to initiate different dialogue branches. So the player can talk to different characters about weapons that they've found or clues that they've gathered within their environment to go and interrogate them further. And lastly, the pivotal choice. One of the characters that the players interacted with and possibly formed an attachment to killed the victim, and the player needs to make the choice of one of the three to take the blame. Continuing on the methodology, we're going to talk about the environment. The environment that the player occupies is an island that illustrates social stratification in a meaningful way. It's a small world that I created where the player is teleported to upon the start of the artifact. It's split into 3 distinct geographical locations. The lowest elevation is the lower class, the base of the hill is the middle class, and the top of the hill is the upper class. In this, we have a literal class divide, illustrated by a fence line that is the extreme difference between the upper and lower classes. It completely blocks the upper class's view of the lower class, but the lower class can always see the mansions from the upper class. And then the trash along the fence line between the upper and lower classes that reinforce the former's views of the latter. Player character parity of the arbiter. What exactly is an arbiter? An arbiter is an authority figure. Their purpose is to settle disputes. They have social influence in specific situations, and they are there to gather information. Successful parity for the player character looks like being motivated to solve the case, feeling suspicious at the right time, and feeling confident in their accusations. In the parity of society, there's the divided social structure that was mentioned earlier. Each class is literally divided. Interactions between the social classes follow different vernaculars. Each one has a different way of speaking to the player and about one another, and to one another. Roles. Each section of society has their own distinct way of life. The lower class is very communal. They center around fishing. They center around society because they need one another's help. The middle class is also quite communal. They center around farming, and you see them often relaxing with one another at the beach. And then upper class, you see most of them relaxing. There are very few of them, and they spurn the player character when they come into contact. And that's a perfect segue into othering. The player character is not only one committing acts of judgment. The non-player characters also judge and express their feelings about the player character. And this is done through ambient dialogue that the player can either engage with or overhear as they pass by other NPCs in the world. Gathering and interpreting data. Data from this was captured by 12 playtests that I specified to give me feedback. This does not capture, however, all the data points of the artifact throughout the entire production process. The data points that I'd like to focus on are data on motivational parity, data on emotional parity, successful elements, and unsuccessful elements. First, let's talk about motivational parity, gameplay, and design. The data that I focused on gathering was to gauge both the engagement with the gameplay moments that I designed for the player and how satisfying testers found them to be. Figure 1 up at the top illustrates which activities players participate in different gameplay interactions. This shows across the board that players were actively participating in all gameplay interactions that I set up. Figure 2 illustrates the player engagement with the interactions. Here we see that there are some interactions that players took less of an interest in actively engaging in beyond the surface level. And then Figure 3, we have testers rating the satisfaction of each of these interactions. On average, the most engaging aspects of the artifact fell within the somewhat satisfied to satisfied range. The data for this shows that there are activities the players, dependent upon their interests, engaged their motivational parity. This, as stated in previous slides, is something that can be entirely pragmatic in nature. The characters interrogating non-player characters and exploration all have high rates of participation, engagement, and satisfaction among the testers. On to motivational parity, characters, and society. The information that I focused on for motivational parity for society was how they felt about specific characters. How did they interpret the characteristics and motivations based on their interactions? This type of data is soft, in that it is entirely in player interpretation of non-player characters' interactions and motivations. I use this data to determine if the players spend enough time with these characters to understand them and their quirks. From this I determined that testers did read into the traits that I wanted them to, with how I wanted each person to each character to read. Lee is a lower class person. He is distrusting to authority figures and those that he sees as his betters. So the characteristics of defensive, honest, stubborn, and loyal are valid interpretations of his actions. And then Miriam is our middle class character that is a social climber and also postures as being innocent. She exhibits behaviors that I observed in upper middle class people throughout my life, which is helpful, jealous, vindictive, power hungry, and grieving over the loss of her brother, which are also valid. Regina is our upper class character and is part of the ruling body and acts like it openly. She is self-interested, which can read as conniving. So conniving, snobby, and annoying are all valid reads of how she is as a character. Emotional parity, the arbiter. The information that I focused on for emotional parity for the first part was how the players felt about being the arbiter, and if they shared traits with this type of character. This type of data is also soft, and that is more of how the player connects with the character they're playing. I decided to go with gauging if testers felt like they shared traits with the arbiter, and if they had any differing feelings. With the majority of the testers feeling that connection with how the arbiter felt, this artifact was successful from a writing standpoint. The interesting thing is that the players related to wanting to find the truth and the curiosity that the arbiter exhibited, which also contributes to motivational parity. Emotional parity interactions with social classes. I also wanted to capture data on the interactions between the players and non-player characters. I was curious about their interactions with non-player characters that exist on the island that create ambient narrative moments. Figure 4, this data that I wanted to gauge how the player felt about members of each social class, including generic and mainline NPCs. The second data point that I wanted was to see the level of discomfort that players felt in the social classes. The data points are pretty close to where I expected them to be. I designed the upper class to be the least accommodating to the player. If I had further time to explore this, I would have added interactions between NPC members of different social classes to show the player how the non-player characters interact with one another. Emotional parity, the choice. The information that I focused on for emotional parity in the last half was to see who the players chose to accuse. Did they see them as sympathetic, making their choice harder? The data that I found about the choice let me know a few things. One, that the choice that I gave the player wasn't as effective as I wanted it to be, because there was one person that got targeted the most often. From the standpoint of pivotal choice, it shows that this has the potential to be effective, but the way I implemented it in my artifact was not entirely effective in the way that I set it up. As an even better if from this data, it would be good to have the player spend more time on one or two characters as companions to steadily learn about them. As you can see, Miriam was the one that was most frequently accused, and on average, players did not sympathize with her. However, there were at least a couple of players that really sympathized, and this is an interesting bit of data because it shows that there is potential in this artifact to create sympathy with the perpetrator. What elements create successful parity? Interactions. There are robust interactions that the player can have with both NPCs and the world space. Generic NPCs that characterize the world space were also effective. Exploration. The island has 3 diverse locations that can be explored. This keeps the player around trying to find clues. Motivation. The testers had the motivation to solve the mystery. The moment-to-moment gameplay kept people searching, even when they were lost. The pivotal choice. This was an unsuccessful element, because the choice of the artifact wasn't as impactful as I intended it to be. This resulted in many unsuccessful moments of emotional parity. The players tended to stay more in the motivational parity, which is still a valid and necessary experience. Unnatural implemented game mechanics. Note-taking was not a thing that was done naturally or actively in Fallout 4. The lack of a smooth, interactive method of doing this created a lack of agency in this detective element. This makes note-taking less valuable of a method for parity. And the player feeling lost. Initially, having no visualization for goals made it so that players felt genuinely lost when they weren't progressing the quest as intended. As a designer, despite the desire for strong social simulation without many HUD elements, some are needed in order to maintain the tracking of smaller goals, which these elements were added in later in the process. Now, what are the best practices? The identified design elements for motivational and emotional parity. Small manageable goals. These goals help the player to have meaningful reasons to stay in the game outside of their own desire to play it. Environmental interactions. In conjunction with goals, having them tied to interacting with the environment increase the time in which players spend exploring the world. Active societal interactions. The desire to interact and learn more from non-player characters satisfies players on both the motivational and emotional aspect when they're done well. These interactions give further meaning to what a player is doing if they're able to form bonds with the characters. Passive societal interactions. These fill in gaps about the player's knowledge about their own character in the world. And then player choice. Despite the player choice not necessarily working in the context of this artifact, it is still very important to have a player choice or a solid narrative beat in order to engage emotional parity in a player. How can this be continued? Using companions to create a bond that can be central to an impactful choice. Having a more linear story with specific story beats versus focusing on social simulation. The use of an engine that doesn't require specific dialogue slots. My personal recommendations would be Creation Kit for Skyrim or Neverwinter Nights. Limiting the number of scenes with fewer dialogue lines for fewer but more impactful choices. And a greater variety of non-player prompted character barks. Here are my sources. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?